This seminar is going to be hosted by Research Area 5. And Zhang will present our speaker. Please.
Thank you very much. So now it's May and our turn for hosting the Bolin Center seminar series. And we are very honored to have Bon Smith here. And Professor Smith is from Lund University working on this ecosystem climate modeling. And yeah, he's from this department of physical geography and ecosystem science. It's a long name, but similar to our department in here, the physical geography. And they have a very strong modeling groups on ecosystem modeling. So that's also, we need to mention that they also have a Swedish strategic research area. It's called MERGE, right? Yes. And this MERGE group, they are developing this dynamic vegetation model, and it's widely used by a lot of international groups. And since we also working on this climate modeling, and now it's towards a Earth system model, and our model called EC-Earth is also uses LPJ-GUESS. Now it's trying coupling and do more research. So it's also kind of collaboration between two strategic research areas. So I think now I give you the floor, and then, yeah, you will talk more about your research on this ecosystem modeling. So you're
okay, great. Thanks very much. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming. Yeah, so I thought that I'd give you maybe it's a provocative question here. Do we need to account for ecology, meaning the interactions between organisms and the physical environment, including the climate, of course, as well as the interactions among organisms between different species, different trophic groups, and so on? Are those things that we need to take into account in order to make reliable models of climate change? And it won't surprise you that I'm going to work my way towards answering a provisional yes to that question by means of some examples. So an outline of the talk, then, just what I'm going to cover. So some words of motivation in the beginning, just pointing out that, in fact, we know that the ecology of terrestrial ecosystems is already changing, apparently in response to climate change and other dimensions of global change. And we can ask the question then, given that ecosystems and the biosphere are part of the climate system, how might that be expected to feed back to the climate? I'll say just a few brief words about the tools that we're working with in our group in Lund and in collaboration with others to do this. It includes an offline so-called dynamic vegetation model, or a vegetation ecosystem model called LPJ-GUESS, and also an Earth system model. We work with a few of those. EC-Earth was mentioned by Zhang, but the results I'll be showing today are all from the application of a regional Earth system model system that includes our offline vegetation model as a component. And then I'll run you through three different examples in contrasting regional settings of the Arctic, the tropics, both Africa and South America, where we've applied this model and use it to try and describe the coupled dynamics of the land surface and the climate in those regions, and the impacts that the reciprocal impacts that has, as an example of how ecology and climate might be affecting each other. So, so to start with, then, what do we know about the way ecosystems have been changing in concert with post-industrial climate change? So one line of evidence, perhaps the first line of really robust evidence that has been seen, reported from the 1990s, is the phenomenon of northern greening, illustrated with this example here from a paper you can see from 2001, where the yellow-red colors here are areas where NDVI, the normalized difference vegetation index, detected in spectral reflectance data from satellites, has been showing a positive trend through the 80s and the 90s, essentially. You can see there are areas where this index has been going up, other areas where it's been going down, but on average, we see an increase in this index, which is taken to be a reflection of something like vegetation cover, leafiness, and also vegetation activity, the amount of photosynthesis that's going on at the surface. And what we now know through quite a large number of follow-up studies of different kinds, both empirical and model-based, is that this greenness can be attributed quite robustly to the effect of a warming climate that is, above all, increasing the growing season, the length of the growing season. Spring comes a bit earlier, maybe the autumn comes a bit later, and in between there you have the time when the vegetation is active, accumulating carbon and using that to grow and spread and expand. And in particular, we see an increased representation of the woody elements of the vegetation, trees and shrubs, compared to former, somewhat colder times. We also have reported examples of species whose distribution in relation to climate variables is changing as the climate variables themselves change, as the isotherms and the isolines advance across the landscape, the species follow. It's not true of all species, but there are certainly examples where that is seen. Here's one. This is holly, a plant that's associated with Christmas in Anglo-Saxon countries like Australia, where I come from. It's regarded as being part of the native flora of Denmark, for example, but not of Sweden. But in the last 50 years or so, there have been apparently spontaneous colonization events for this species around the South Swedish coast, apparently following the 0-degree isotherm for the coldest month of the year, for January in this case. Tree lines are another very visible feature of the landscape that it's well known to be associated, not always, but very often with temperature gradients, of course. And there are many examples, including the Swedish one here, Mount Nula in the north of Sweden near Abisko, where the tree line has advanced upwards or towards the colder end of the climate gradient over the last 100 years or so. We see here also a summary from a meta-analysis of 166 tree line sites around the world, where on average, for the case of the diffuse tree lines, those that are more likely to be governed by temperature gradients, as opposed to other factors such as edaphic boundaries or geological boundaries, topography, and so on. Those tree lines on average, not in every case, but on average, and significantly so, are advancing either poleward or upward, up the mountain slope, which of course can be explained by climate warming. Another interesting one is the increasing preponderance of trees and shrubs, and particularly shrubs, which is occurring, already mentioned it, in cold climate regions such as ours and also further north, the northern high latitudes, but it's actually also occurring in dry places, where it can be explained by the enhancement of the water use efficiency, the extent to which plants can utilize water as one resource in their productivity, and which is known in many cases to be enhanced by rising CO2 concentrations as a direct physiological response to rising concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's not surprising that we see this phenomenon, shrubification, shrub expansion as it's called, occurring particularly in dry climate ecosystems. And you see an example here from South Africa over roughly a 100-year period here, with shrubs and trees becoming a much more visible part of the landscape there. These are all natural responses, apparently, to climate change. This is ecology. This is organisms responding to their physical environment. But, of course, compounded with that, we have land use change going on, the most obvious case being the deforestation that we see going on in the tropics. And this example here is from Brazil. You can see the rainforest here giving way to open patches of pasture and agricultural fields and the like. Of course, this is been a very strong trend in the last few decades. So, of course, given that the land surface and its cover, which very often is vegetation cover, forms part of the coupled climate system, we can expect there to be implications for the climate, forcing of the climate through these sorts of changes going on. And how does this work? So to summarize two of the main, not the only, feedback phenomena, but perhaps two of the most important ones. One is to do with the albedo. Albedo is just the reflectivity of the surface. And we can illustrate this very nicely with a winter satellite picture here over our area, the Baltic Sea area here. And you can see in the contrast in the southern part there between agricultural Denmark, which is brighter colored compared with forested Sweden, right? forest makes the surface darker. That means less light is being reflected back, and more energy is being absorbed by the surface. And of course, in the end, that energy has to go back, and it goes back largely in the form of warmth to the air near the surface. The effect of albedo change it can be even stronger in the snow season. And you see in the northern part of the picture here the contrast between alpine and therefore tree deficient Norway compared with forested Sweden, where the darker grey color is signifying a lower albedo, meaning a greater uptake of energy, which can be expected to feed back to the local energy cycle. Vegetation has another important effect upon energy exchange with the surface, and that's via the partitioning of the return energy flux from the surface to the atmosphere into latent versus sensible heat. The latent heat is associated with evapotranspiration, so with evaporation of water from mainly from the leaf surfaces of the vegetation. The more leaves there are, the greater the surface area for the evaporation to take place. That robs warmth from the air near the surface and cools the surface, as opposed to a situation where there's very little evaporation going on, and then much more of the energy is returned as sensible heat that instead warms the air. And then another very important feedback phenomenon that's not a biophysical one, as it's called, as is in the case of albedo and evapotranspiration feedback, but rather a biogeochemical one, and it's to do, of course, with the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, which is, it goes up due to emissions, but there are also sinks within the Earth system that take carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere, and in roughly equal amounts. The sinks are in the oceans, but also on land. And in the case of land, it's due to a surplus of photosynthesis, taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, converting it into biomass initially, versus the respiration processes, metabolic processes essentially of the biota that return carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. In a steady state where the climate isn't changing, we would expect respiration and photosynthesis to roughly match. But in a situation where the whole system is evolving due to increasing emissions particularly, we can get an imbalance, and that's what we know from measurements that we have today. We have a surplus of photosynthesis relative to respiration, and also we have a return flux that's due to wildfires as part of the return flux, and it accounts for about 25% of emissions, so it's a very significant number. You can also see the green field here that the size of the sink varies from year to year. In certain years, we can even have a source of carbon dioxide from the biosphere back to the atmosphere. It's something that's quite dynamic and could change and can be expected to change in the future. Of course, this is something that we may very well wish to understand more about if we want to make accurate climate projections, among other things. And one thing to remember is that we have very strong lag processes in the biosphere part of the climate system. The biosphere responds slowly. Trees, for example, grow slowly, absorbing carbon, storing it as biomass in the growing stems or in new individuals of trees growing up. But over time, phenology, that's the turnover of biomass, gets converted into litter. For example, leaves are shed, roots are replaced, and so on. But also individuals die, they become part of the litter, they're decomposed, and the respiration of the decomposing organisms, particularly microbes in the soil, returns carbon dioxide back to the system. This is a very lagged process. It's something we need to account for, particularly in the case of slow-growing vegetation that can store a lot of carbon. That's the case for global forests. So these are all factors that we try to account for in models that can tell us something about the biosphere-climate interactions then. And we work with a model called LPJ-GUESS, the Lund Jena General Ecosystem Simulator. We can say this is a global model in the sense it can be applied across the global surface with some degree of reliability, if you like. But it's a model that's unique for its family in terms of representing the vegetation in a very explicit and detailed way. And you can see a little visualization here with output from the model representing a simulated landscape of northern Sweden. You can see the individual species, or we call those plant functional types, but also individuals and patches of the landscape that differ in terms of the stage they're at, in terms of their recovery from some disturbance event. Because land use is part of the story, we need to represent major types of human interventions in the landscape as well, and we do that as well, representing natural vegetation, but also, for example, managed forests with silviculture going on, clearing, thinning, and so on, cropland, different kinds of cropping systems, and pasture as well. I don't have time, and I don't think the interest today is in me giving you lots of examples of, or validating the model. Where does it have skill? Where does it fail? And so on. We can say, look, with this model, like with any other, it has some skill and also fails in some situations. But over the years, this model's been around for about 20 years, we've done certainly lots of studies and learned about the behavior of the model, and it has a certain usefulness to it. So to understand how the biosphere then, meaning the terrestrial ecosystems and the atmosphere interact, then we need to make an Earth system model, a model that couples the climate system, the physical climate system, together with the biosphere. We do that by marrying our ecosystem model, LPJ-GUESS, to an atmospheric model. In this case, it's the Rossby Center atmospheric model, developed by SMHI colleagues. And the idea is that the climate model needs to know the biophysical properties of the land surface, such as the albedo, the leaf area index, which governs things like evapotranspiration, roughness length as well, which is a property that depends, or differs for different kinds of vegetation, different kinds of surfaces, different land use types as well. And this information then goes in, is generated dynamically by the vegetation model. It's used to update these biophysical parameters in the climate model. The climate model, of course, simulates then the evolution of the climate in response to that and other forcings, and which it feeds back then to the vegetation model, influencing the dynamics there. And so we end up with a closed loop for what we call the biophysical feedback, those that are associated with things like albedo change and change in the partitioning of the return energy, fluxes into latent and sensible heat. We can also calculate greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide emissions, net carbon dioxide emissions, methane as well, working also on other greenhouse gases such as N2O and VOCs and all the rest of it. So we can say that we don't have the full feedback loop because this is a regional system. Biogeochemical feedbacks are mixed in the whole global atmosphere. Here we just focus on one little part, maybe not so small, but one part of the land surface. But we can calculate the effects, for example, of biogeophysical feedbacks associated with vegetation change on greenhouse gas balances, and therefore have a sort of open loop also for the biogeochemical feedbacks, those that are mediated by greenhouse gases. So now some applications of these systems, and touching on the question of are the ecological responses, or the changes in land surface properties associated with vegetation responses to climate change, land use change, are those significant for the climate system, or can we ignore them? So we can begin by, we can go to some extreme places, and we can go extremely cold, we can go extremely dry, we can go places where there's a lot of energy being moved about. Let's start with extremely cold. So when we go to the Arctic, and here's our vegetation model simulating vegetation types, broad vegetation patterns across the Pan-Arctic area. You can see the blue colors there, which are the taiga or the boreal forest, giving way to various kinds of tundra vegetation, much more open vegetation, which is something like what is also known to occur there. You can see the vegetation, the observed vegetation map there. So now we're running this model in an experiment where we have, so the way it works with the regional climate model is you have to tell it something about the climate at the boundaries. The model doesn't simulate that, that's input. That's known as the boundary conditions. In this experiment, we take the boundary conditions from a global climate model, East Earth in this case. The external forcing is a trajectory of radiative forcing in the atmosphere, which is the sort of the energy balance change in the atmosphere due to mostly due to greenhouse gases, using scenarios for that, which the scenarios that are used these days are known as representative concentration pathways, or RCP. So that's the external forcing here. Then we have East Earth, the global climate model providing boundary conditions describing the climate at the boundaries of a regional domain covering the Arctic. And then we have the coupled system, both the climate and the vegetation evolving in concert with each other. What we see here, what we're looking at here, is the historical situation and then three different situations for the last, for the subsequent 100 years, so up to the end of the present century, 2100, for 3 different RCP scenarios. And if you like, you can just focus on the right-hand one, which is RCP 8.5, representing an increase in radiative forcing of 8.5 watts per meter squared on average across the globe, compared with pre-industrial conditions. It's a business as usual or a strong forcing scenario. But actually, regardless of which scenario we look at, what we see is a lot of trees and forest, shrubs, and so on, the bluish, greenish colors here, replacing what was there before, namely more tundra. So more forest, less tundra. What effects does this have on the climate? Here's what comes out here. Each row again is one of the forcing scenarios. The picture is rather similar for all 3, so let's focus on the bottom row, the strongest forcing scenario. Each column here is one of the seasons, right? Winter, December, January, February, then spring, then summer, then autumn. You can see the strongest feedbacks here. This is the additional change in temperature for that season due to the biogeophysical feedback, due to the effects that vegetation change, this increasing preponderance of trees across the landscape is having on temperatures. And we see that the biggest effect is a lot of red and yellow colors across the land part of this Arctic domain here during spring. So it's getting warmer in spring. It's getting warmer by somewhere between 1 to 2, in some places up to 3 degrees warmer than it would have been if we had ignored or hadn't taken into account in the model the feedbacks of vegetation change on temperatures. We can also look at summer, and in summer we see instead over land areas here blue and green colors. This means it may still be getting warmer, but it's not getting as much warmer due to the feedbacks. The feedbacks are causing a cooling relative to what we might expect had we ignored the changes in vegetation. We can look at precipitation change as well, and here it's a bit more of a mixed pattern, but if we look particularly at summer, what we see is something of an increase in rainfall. Not so very much, 10 to 20 millimeters or so over the summer season, but still a little bit of extra rainfall in the summertime. What we're seeing here is the effect, mainly two syndromes or phenomena going on. One is about the springtime, where the extra trees poking out of the snow has made the surface darker, more energy is absorbed. It's an albedo feedback, and it's a warming feedback. In the summertime, what we're seeing, particularly in the strongest forcing scenario, is actually that there's more evapotranspiration going on, and that's more latent heat, less sensible heat, and temperatures are going down a little bit as a result of that. Extra water vapor in the atmosphere also means more rain, and that would explain why, on average, precipitation was going up a little bit in the summertime. We can summarize this also as a seasonal cycle across the whole simulation domain. It makes it very clear here. What we see is increased warming on average, something like 1 to 2 degrees warmer in the springtime, meaning also that the growing season would come a bit earlier. Vegetation would be able to become active earlier due to higher temperatures occurring earlier in the spring. Summers are actually now a little bit cooler relative to what they would be had we not taken into account the vegetation change. So summarizing this, due to the feedbacks, we see a seasonality shift resulting in a longer growing season with an earlier temperature peak, evaporative cooling in the summer, which evens out the growing season temperature profile somewhat. These are conditions that ecologically would be expected to favor more of what we're already seeing today, namely an increasing preponderance of woody elements in the vegetation, shrubs, and as well as tree line advance. A follow-up question about these are just the biogeophysical feedbacks, what we can simulate explicitly in a regional coupled Earth system model. But we can also go to the open loop that we have for the biogeochemical feedback and ask, so what about carbon balance? How would these changes be affecting the carbon balance, the carbon exchange between the ecosystems and the atmosphere over the study domain, over the Arctic? And what we found here is that, in fact, in our model at least, the biogeophysical feedbacks result in a little bit more uptake of carbon, a net increase in uptake and storage of carbon from the atmosphere across the Arctic. It's the difference between the red and the blue line in this trajectory here going up to the end of the 21st century. We can also look at this as a distribution across grids, across the thousands or or so grid cells across the Arctic here. And what we see that what's happening above all is that forests, the blue arrows here, or the blue histogram bars rather, forests are absorbing more carbon. The growing season's getting longer, more trees are growing. Those growing trees are storing carbon in the form of stem biomass mostly, at the expense of carbon storage in the tundra. We can look more closely at what the processes are going on inside here, and what we see going on is what I just mentioned, growing trees and shrubs accumulating carbon in their stems. Compare the blue trajectory rather with the red one. But at the same time, it's getting warmer, so that means more respiration in warmer soils, releasing carbon. Forests produce more litter than the tundra they replace would be producing. They're more productive. That results in larger loads of litter. Again, it's a store of carbon. And adding these components together, we see that over the 21st century, in our model, where the biophysical feedbacks lead to a sink of around about 12.8 petagrams of carbon. That's billions of tons of carbon, and roughly the equivalent of a year's CO2 emissions due to human activity. So not that much, but still an increased sink. Okay, so moving on now from one type of extreme to another kind of extreme, namely the dry lands of the Earth. So one thing that we're recognizing more and more quite recently, that savanna ecosystems, dry land ecosystems that include trees and shrubs as well as grasses, are playing a very important role in the global carbon cycle, and moreover they're an increasing sink for atmospheric CO2. So what we're seeing here if you just look at the time series here, what we see is the intra-annual variations, the variations year to year in the net carbon exchange, the uptake or release of carbon from savanna dryland ecosystems around the world. And you can see a lot of variation from year to year. Often it reflects the ENSO dynamics, the El Nino years, which are typically drought years in low latitude parts of the world, and the La Nina years, which are wet years. And essentially in a wet year, the savanna greens up, there's a lot of carbon uptake due to a lot of vegetation activity. In a dry year, the system is pretty much inactive and it just releases carbon through decomposition. We also see a positive trend over time. So savannas are getting greener, they're absorbing more and more carbon on average every year. So we want to look at this kind of system to understand more about it, and we go to Africa where we can find a lot of these savannas going on. Very similar experiment now, again with the coupled model here. This time, slightly different emission scenario, but it's sort of a business as usual, radiative forcing if you like. It's a different GCM providing boundary conditions, the Canadian model in this case, but within the domain illustrated here, within the African continent, we simulate the climate and the land surface in terms of the vegetation cover evolving dynamically and in a coupled way. What we're looking here is the leaf area index. It's a measure, if you like, of the greenness of the land surface, quite associated with the presence of trees. As we'd expect, we simulate a sort of rainforest in the equatorial parts, the Congo Basin there, and savanna ecosystems in a sort of band around the edge to the north and the south of the central equatorial area. In the future, on the right here, we see the change in leaf area index in the last 20 years of the 21st century compared with today. You can see the green belt here. The leaf area index has gone up by a factor of about 1. That's one extra layer of leaves on average across the whole savanna, but not so much in the rainforest area in the center there. This can be explained by CO2 fertilization, but it turns out that rainfall is part of the story as well. Here we have the attribution of the temperature and precipitation changes, once again, to the feedbacks themselves, the changes in albedo, the changes in evapotranspiration, and how they're affecting the temperature and the rainfall. You can see on the top right there that the vegetation changes, the savanna greening, is causing something of a decrease in temperature, or rather the temperature is still going up in the future, but they're going up less thanks to, it's actually more evapotranspiration, right? It's a leaf, the savannas are leafier, larger surface area for evapotranspiration to take place. With regard to precipitation, what we see above all is that it's getting drier across the equatorial parts where the rainforest is. And summarizing this up, what we see going on is that there are teleconnections in terms of rainfall distribution. There are circulation changes that are affecting the distribution of rainfall across the low latitude parts of the African continent in our experiment. So basically the story is this. The moisture comes in from the surrounding seas, particularly from the Atlantic. The higher leaf area index with more evapotranspiration going on tends to cool the air, relatively speaking, in the savanna belt surrounding the central area. That results in a stronger temperature gradient between the equatorial part and the savanna part, changes in pressure gradients which result in changes in circulation, particularly the Hadley circulation that distributes water from the central area out into the savanna region, like this. And we get a redistribution of rainfall patterns compared with what we expect today from the central rainforest area out into the savanna. The savanna is becoming more like a rainforest. The rainforest, if you like, is becoming more like a savanna. It's just a model result. Could it be realistic? And one thing we know is that this very pattern is going on today. We know this from satellite observations as well as from modeling. We see this happening today in the African continent. So it's something that could be realistic. We'll move on to another tropical situation, analogous to Africa, but different in one way, and it's a place where there's a lot of land use change going on as well. I'm talking, of course, about the Amazon basin in South America. Similar kind of experiment again. Here we see the precipitation and biomass patterns. The biomass is very much reflecting the presence of wood. More wood means more biomass. So where we have a lot of biomass, that means that's where we see forest. And it won't surprise you to know that we see the forest growing where it's wettest, around the South American continent, or for that matter, that's very much the case in low and mid latitudes around the world. In South America, it's known that there's kind of a bimodal distribution of biomass in relation to rainfall, where you find either you have high biomass systems, rainforest, or low biomass systems, savanna. Savanna, of course, being characteristic of the lower rainfall part of the region, rainforest being characteristic of the high rainfall part, but you don't get a continuous distribution. You can see the frequency here, so a spatial distribution here, that you have most areas either have quite low biomass or quite high biomass. There isn't much going on in between. We can talk about why another time. But this is something I'm going to come back to, so that's why I mention it now. Now, this is an area that's been studied in Earth system modeling for a couple of decades now, and a pioneering study was the one emanating from the Hadley Center, using the Hadley Center global climate model, or it was really an Earth system model, maybe the first operational Earth system model, coupling vegetation dynamics and carbon cycle dynamically to a global climate model, published around the year 2000. And one thing that happened in the first simulations that reported from this model was that the Amazon collapsed. As the climate warmed and became drier, particularly in this region around South America, due to, among other things, an enhancement of the ENSO system, this El Nino, La Nina, those fluctuations. When a drought year came along, the effect of that was that the rainforest declined a little bit. That reduced the amount of evapotranspiration, enhancing the effect of the drying in terms of a reduction in the convective recycling of rainfall that's characteristic for the Amazon basin and other tropical rainforest areas. So an amplifying feedback, the effect of which in this model was what you see on this diagram here. Over time, the trees declining drastically by maybe 75% of their initial cover to be replaced by a much more open landscape, what you call a savanna, or even a grassland instead of a forest, over the whole of the central Amazon area, this forest. So is this a phenomenon that we could reproduce if we looked at it with our system, particularly looking at then with these convective rainfall recycling that's rather a small scale meteorological process, and something that maybe you wouldn't expect a GCM with its very large grid cells, 250 by 150 kilometers on a side, something like that, to capture very accurately. What about a higher resolution regional Earth system model? So let's look at this. That's what we did. We did the the analogous experiment using our regional model. And here's what comes out. This is a business as usual scenario in RCP 8.5, right? That's the strong radiative forcing for the future. We look at both land use change, the deforestation going on across, particularly around the southern and southeastern fringes of the Amazon basin. You can see the little land use change map in the bottom left there. And then we look also at the response of the vegetation to the climate and the effect that has in terms of a feedback to climate. And what comes out is that we have, due to both land use change and vegetation change, we see a slight enhancement of temperatures. It gets a little bit warmer. It's not particularly a surprise in the case of land use change, because the conversion of forest to open land results in reduced evapotranspiration, so less latent heat. But the biggest effects, or the most significant effects, are in terms of rainfall. And it turns out that land use change, it's mostly the Cerrado area to the eastern part of the Amazon basin there, is actually getting more rainfall following the deforestation. It's not intuitively obvious why that would be the case. Whereas the central Amazon area gets less rainfall due to whatever the ecological responses of the rainforest vegetation there are. So we can look at this more closely. So regarding the land use change, although it seems counterintuitive, there are studies that are suggesting that it might be the case that when you have at least partial deforestation of the landscape, the increase in roughness of the surface that results, which increases turbulent exchange between the atmosphere and the surface, could actually enhance rainfall up to a certain point. It turns out this is what we're seeing in our model going on as well. In terms of the changes in the natural responses of the rainforest itself, what we're actually seeing is an increase in tree cover in the future, despite the reduction in rainfall over the central Amazon area there. So we're seeing the opposite. We're not seeing an Amazon dieback going on. We're seeing an Amazon greening going on in a coupled Earth system simulation here. So the opposite of what the Hadley Center came up with 20 years ago or so. One reason this may not seem so crazy is because, in fact, the drying is happening mostly in the wet season, when there's plenty of water around anyway. Whereas in the dry season, even in the rainforest, there's a dry season where the trees become water stressed, but the shift in precipitation is not so high, as you can see in the lower panels here, which are showing the rainfall change in the dry season. Looking more closely at this, now I'm going to come back to the distribution of the biomass and biomass relationship to precipitation across the Amazon basin. Here you can see the two dark blue areas here, where the abundances are higher both for forest and savanna. So with forest in the wetter part, savannas in the drier part. And now we look at the changes due to different parts of the coupled system here. You can see the little figure here. The red part is those interactions that are taken into account. We're looking at different simulations here with different parts of the coupling switched on. So if we just look at the effect of the climate change as simulated by the climate model on the vegetation and how that's affecting the land cover, we see both increases and decreases in biomass across this distribution, or shifts in the distribution. As we go from purple to green, that means we're going from low to higher frequency. So here's one. What we're seeing now is that we're getting lower biomass at the same rainfall level. And this is actually a mild version of the Amazon dieback phenomenon seen in the Hadley Center study. But it's only part of the story, and so it disappears when all the different effects are compounded together, as you'll see shortly. The other effect is in the savanna area, that due to rainfall becoming more extreme in the future, sometimes it gets even drier than today, sometimes it gets even wetter than today. When it gets drier, it doesn't matter. The savanna biota are adapted to that. They're drought-tolerant species. So their productivity doesn't go down very much, but when it gets wetter, they flourish and bloom. So here we're seeing an effect of a wider extreme, or a wider distribution of rainfall between years, causing higher biomass at the same precipitation level in the savanna part of the region. Now we can look at the effect that carbon dioxide has, and carbon dioxide is very important here. Due to CO2 fertilization, the increased water use efficiency of the vegetation under higher carbon dioxide concentrations. Right, we see we go from purple to green here. We're going up the biomass scale at the same level of precipitation. Higher water use efficiency, very strong effect going on. When we look at the effect of climate and CO2 change together, accounting for the feedbacks of the subsequent vegetation change on the climate, we get this picture. It's not unlike the CO2 effect, as it's showing that the CO2 effect is the strongest explanatory mechanism here. So we have increased water use efficiency, right? WE, water use efficiency is going up, pushing us up the biomass scale. But we also have reduction in precipitation. Remember that? I showed you the precipitation was going down over the central Amazon. So the net vector is sort of going up to the top left like that. We're going to higher biomass and generally lower precipitation. That's true both for the forest part and the savanna part. What about the land use change? So if we look at the land use change, we see essentially the effects of forest clearing. At the same biomass level, we have less biomass because the trees are being cut down and replaced by pasture and corn and sugarcane plantations and the rest of it. At the same time, we saw that due to the roughness phenomenon I mentioned, that in the main land use area in the eastern part of the Amazon basin, precipitation is actually going up, pushing us from purple to green along the precipitation axis instead. So all of these factors come together in one overall dynamic, right? Here it is. And what we see essentially is three components to it. We see a forest climate syndrome pushing us to higher biomass in the forest part. We see a land use climate effect that pushes us to lower biomass but higher precipitation. And we see a savanna climate interaction that moves the savanna into a higher biomass regime, but also at higher precipitation. So quite a complex story, and one that you could only really tease apart by looking at each component individually, as I've tried to walk you through here. So, conclusions, what can we come up with on this? So I hope that I've convinced you and you've seen that the climate changes that result from the vegetation changes and the land use changes that seem reasonable enough, as it were, are significant. We're talking about several degrees of change in temperature, changes in seasonality of temperature as well, changes in circulation patterns, changes in rainfall in areas that are already stressed by low rainfall in various low latitude regions. So ecology does matter for climate change if our model is to be trusted. Vegetation change, such as greening, shrubification, tree line advance, could, it seems, significantly amplify Arctic warming, especially in the late snow season due to an albedo effect, but even in the summertime due to increased evapotranspiration, cooling the climate in the summertime, even in the Arctic, in that cold system. Greening and browning shifts, such as already observed, for example, in Africa, could modify circulation systems and rainfall patterns. That's what we simulated. Land use effects can be important too and can interact with the ecological responses, the natural responses of the vegetation to climate and CO2 change to produce quite a complex system of land surface atmosphere interactions in the future. And taken together, our studies, I think, are suggesting that reciprocal land cover climate interactions would seem to be important to account for if we want to make models that are representing the evolution of the future climate in a realistic way. Thanks for listening.
Now it's time for questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I particularly enjoyed your last slides where you compare the different drivers of change in the Amazon. I was wondering how did you separate these different effects, since I'm guessing in the model they are all coupled together.
Yeah. Yeah, it's roughly as I tried to show with the little cartoon here, right? That this is the fully coupled system that we potentially simulate, but we can switch off. For example, we can fix the land use change at present day levels and allow the vegetation to evolve only through through ecology and so on. So that's how we do it, yeah, with a series of simulations.
Yeah, thanks for a super talk. That was really interesting. I wanted to ask you about the albedo feedback. It's appeared that as you went up to the higher radiative forcing, RCP 8.5, the albedo forcing actually, the albedo feedback actually decreased, or if you took the summer and the winter and combined them.
Yeah.
Why?
I don't know if I can give you a well-qualified answer, but it might not be unexpected because, of course, it interacts with the presence of snow as well. If you take the snow away, the albedo contrast between forest and open land goes down. So I suspect that might be at least part of the answer. Christian. Oh.
Yeah, thanks for the interesting talk. I have a question to the biogeochemical feedback in the Arctic that you presented,
Oh, yeah.
and your results were quite interesting. So we saw an increasing negative feedback or a negative feedback of the vegetation. So the vegetation buffers carbon. But then at the end of the century, it seems to start to level off. And that reminds me a bit to the back to the 2001 papers and the NPP comparison, Potsdam comparison, where we saw this tipping point in 2050 globally, where then it's going back to a positive, probably positive feedback. Is that what you would also expect if you would run the model further?
Yes.
2300?
Yeah, exactly. So these vegetation, we call them, I use the term anyway, demography mediated effects, right? Because it's caused by the fact that you have trees growing where there were no trees growing before. For a while they accumulate carbon, but in the end phenology and particularly turnover, so the death of the trees, transfers that carbon to the soil where it decomposes, and actually decomposes faster in the warmer climate, because we know that respiration responds in a roughly exponential way to temperature. So it's always a transient or a temporary buffer that you have. It's just a lagging, and if the climate, were to stabilize, we know pretty much that biosphere carbon balance would come to plus or minus 0 in the end when these lag effects go away. So it's not a question of whether, but when you go from a strong sink back to, in fact, neutral, smaller sink, and then ultimately neutral. Yeah. But these I could mention, so to give a plug for the whole approach here is that, and I mentioned that we have a model that's quite detailed in representing individual trees and the different patches on the landscape and so on, the effects of disturbance regime. So all of that is very important in getting the size of those lag effects right. And many models, for reasons that were understandable when they were developed, it's to do with the computing resources that were available for doing global runs, where computers are probably 10,000 times faster now than when those models were developed. But many of the models are now still being used where these lag effects are patently false in the way they're represented. Yeah.
I have a question about fire and grazing in savanna systems.
Yeah.
A lot of people are talking about the interaction between those, and you didn't say much about that in relation to increased amount of shrubs, for example.
Right. Yeah.
Do you have a comment?
Yeah, it's. I know that in some of the cases where woody encroachment is being seen, it's being attributed, at least in part, to, for example, withdrawal from grazing or a suppression of fires. But I think I don't know that there's an absolute consensus about it. But I think if you look at the range of studies that have been done, you still see that despite various kinds of effects that are related to the disturbance regime, fires and grazing, and so on, there's still an additional effect that seems to be of physiological origin. And that's assumed here, but we do simulate the fires actually as well as a dynamic process. Yeah.
what comes next? What's the some aspects of ecology and its interactions with climate that you aren't able to model at the moment, but you would like to be able to?
Okay, good question. Yeah, yeah. So one thing is actually about the trophic interactions. So it's certainly in savanna systems, the grazing animals, it's well known that they can be very important in keeping the biomass or the tree cover below the level that you might expect just based on the climate and the water regime. And that's something that we've sniffed at a little bit in some studies. Fire, again, for the same reason, is quite important. We do have a fire model in there, but we, in a side project now, we've been developing a more ecologically defendable fire model. Since fire is in part an ecological process as well, the fire affects different species and also individuals with different characteristics, different age and size differentially. So yeah, there's a couple of aspects anyway.
So I have a little question. I wonder if you have made some experiment in your simulations where you have tried different forcings in the climate model, like what happens if there is a big volcanic eruption that affects the global climate. Do you see any instantaneous effect of that on the vegetation? Like, I mean, in the eruption year or the year after, does the vegetation respond to that kind of instantaneous forcing?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, not with this fully coupled model, but actually we've looked at that in the past as well. When forcing the model with actually just observed climate around the period of the Pinatubo eruption, which was in 1990, I think, and maybe 91. Yeah, and in for a couple of years after that, you see this in the satellite data as well, actually, that the greening goes right down, so it became cooler, and productivity across the northern high latitudes actually went down for a couple of years. So certainly you do see an effect, yeah.
Yeah, following up on the questions before, I want to go a little bit deeper. I mean, in terms of the biogeochemistry, you mentioned mostly climate and CO2 effects on photosynthesis and respiration, and maybe you also have fire in the model as a turnover process, but do you also have other turnover processes in the model, or especially other forest mortality processes driven by drought, for example, or by insect infestations, or do you plan to work on that?
Yes, we've worked on both of those things. So tree mortality in response to general resource stress, that's built in and part of the sort of demography features I mentioned before. Insect attacks is something that we've implemented for the case of bark beetles in Sweden, actually, and some of the other colleagues are working on some sort of more global. They're working on the assumption that you can somehow generalize insect herbivory into a few general types of syndromes that apply globally. I think it's still an open question whether you can do that in a useful way. Could also argue that it's very species specific and so on. But yeah.
Thank you. I have one question about because now we expect that we will use this coupled LPJ-GUESS with Easy Earth to do some paleoclimate modeling.
Yes.
And for the past climate, actually, we don't know that much information about vegetation distribution or landscape. Can we expect that when we have the coupled ones, we will know all the information that, or my question is, what about the initial conditions about the vegetation model? Do you need to give some certain initial conditions, or it will produce according to the climate?
Right, yeah, that's definitely an issue, of course, when you want to go far back in time. But the general concept with a model like this is that the vegetation you get, if you disregard land use, of course, and all human factors, the vegetation you get is a product of the climate there. There's some sensitivity to the soil type, you assume as well, but it's by by and large, it's the climate that's important. And so when we apply the model in, in some sort of last glacial maximum or some climate that we don't have an analogy for today, we'll certainly get a result. Whether it's a realistic one or not is a difficult one to prove because of all the issues with the proxy data and so on. But the model will come up with something, yes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So, any more questions? Yeah. Otherwise, we just thank you very much for this great presentation.